Thank you for coming. So today our speaker is going to be Dr. Janet Turan. Dr. Turan is a professor in the Department of Healthcare Organization and Policy here at UAB and is involved in a bunch of different centers, primarily the Center for AIDS Research. She's really an expert in qualitative and mixed methods research for information development and other purposes. Yes. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's nice to be here again, and I'm going to try to give you all a very brief kind of whirlwind tour introduction to qualitative research. As you may or may know, I teach a whole semester course on this, so it's a little hard to fit it into 1 hour, but I'm doing my best. So I'm just going to start out, and also I just want to say, maybe some of you may have, heard me talk about this before, but please, feel free to bring in your own insights and questions, and as I'm talking, I'm happy to take questions. So I'm going to talk today about qualitative research, which, is something that's becoming more and more familiar in the health sciences, right? We see it all the time now. And basically, it is scientific, rigorous research that helps us to understand a topic from the perspectives of the people who are actually experiencing the issue. And it's really good if you need in-depth and culturally specific information about things that are seen, a little bit less tangible or hard to measure with, with surveys or, lab measurements. So things like people's values and opinions, their decision-making processes, the social context and norms that they're living in, and things like gender roles, religiosity, stigma is something that I study a lot using qualitative research methods. And I think the important thing, really the crux of it, is that you're trying to understand why, how, and under what circumstances things occur. Okay, you can always measure maybe the levels or the prevalence or incidence of something, but if you really want to know why it's happening, how it's happening, when it happens and when it doesn't, you've really got to dig a little deeper. So again, we want depth of understanding. We try to look at social phenomena within their context, not, separated from the context in which things occur. It's often very exploratory. So maybe it's a topic that you don't know much about. You don't know what the predictor variables are. You don't know what kinds of causal relationships to even hypothesize. You can start out with qualitative research and try to get some ideas about that. You can get insight into why people take certain decisions and do certain actions. And of course, in health, this is really important. I mean, we're often trying to change people's health behaviors or do things around. We need to know, why do they decide to do that? Why do they act the way they do? The methods to go along with this sort of philosophy, the methods are very open-ended and iterative. So I'll give you some contrasts with quantitative research, but it's a much more open-ended approach. And often, the methods that you use in these studies are iterative rather than fixed. So you may decide on some methods, but then you may learn some things that make you want to change your methods, and then you may end up going back to the beginning. So it really is a bit more of a flexible research approach. Same sort of thing, emergent rather than pre-structured. We often, in qualitative research, we think of the research respondents as more as active participants in the research process. We don't, think of them as just subjects or respondents or people that we're measuring stuff on. We actually, acknowledge their participation and their real role in creating the research findings. And additionally, we also recognize our own role in shaping the findings of the research, because a qualitative researcher actually interacts very closely with participants. your own kind of background, your knowledge, your biases, everything actually come into that interaction. It's and so you need to sort of recognize that and acknowledge it and think about it. So we actually, we realize that the researcher's role is it's not just an objective bystander, which is true in a lot of quantitative research as well, right? Here it's more openly acknowledged. So, in terms of methods, I'm sure you all have heard about qualitative research methods. Some of the most common ones that you'll hear about and see in the literature are in-depth interviews, or sometimes people call them key informant interviews. In addition, focus groups are also widely used. Another method that used a lot especially in anthropology and ethnography, is observation, and either participant or non-participant observation. But that's something that I also teach in my class because I think it can be useful in health sciences as well. Another type of qualitative research is when you do content analysis of documents or websites or blogs or anything that's sort of already there, written. You can actually analyze those and come up with qualitative themes. Some other qualitative methods that you may have heard about that we often use include cognitive interviews, which are often used to develop surveys and test them. There's some qualitative methods where you can get people to brainstorm on different categories under a certain theme and sort them into categories. It's kind of a semi-structured method. There are some cool methods called photo narrative or photo voice, where you have people go out into their environment and community and take pictures of things around a certain theme or things that are important to them, and then have them both talk about those pictures, but also you can analyze those pictures for content. And although this isn't a qualitative method in itself, a lot of the community-based participatory research methods, CDPR, also use qualitative research methods. It's a good way to involve community members in collecting and analyzing data that's qualitative. So those are just a few examples. There are more variations on all these. Oh, nominal group techniques, maybe something that you all have heard about, which it's a kind of a focus group method where you get people to brainstorm about a topic together and then do kind of a formal ranking. So it's qualitative, but it's a bit more structured. And so that, again, in health research can be a useful thing if you want people to, brainstorm about barriers to accessing healthcare and then have them rank them in terms of how important they are. So as you probably got from that little description, qualitative data can take different forms. In most cases, it is in text form, in that we obtain written transcripts from interviews and focus groups. And we also have field notes and memos that our qualitative researchers write either after an observation or after a focus group. All these things become part of our data. It's also possible to use audio or video recordings directly as a data source and analyze those. And again, you can use videos, photographs, other types of data. And the software that we currently use for qualitative coding and analysis can actually incorporate all these forms of data. So you can code pictures, in the software and things like that. So
What is that software?
that is NVivo, which I'm very happy to announce. I don't know already that it's available free for all maybe actually staff and students. Yeah. It was funny. We were. Yeah. No, it's really great. It's because we were kind of advocating and fighting for that for years, and seemed like no one was listening, and then suddenly it became available. We're like, okay, I don't know how that happened, but it's really nice that it's available now. So that, and it's it's fairly user friendly. Well, we can talk about it more later. So basically, we're talking about sort of contrasting a quantitative approach where you're studying numbers, you're asking how many people practice certain behaviors, and you're trying to find numerical patterns in data, which many of us are more familiar with a qualitative approach where you're looking at the study of words and meaning and trying to understand why people practice certain behaviors and to understand things in depth. Of course, maybe maybe the strongest approach is using mixed methods, where you actually use both of these approaches together to study a problem. I'm not going to get as much into that today, but while you're listening to all this, think about how you can combine it with quantitative research to make even a stronger knowledge base. So this is just a real brief kind of comparison of qualitative versus quantitative research, just so you can sort of see the contrast. And qualitative is really primarily descriptive. You're describing a phenomenon, whereas in quantitative, of course, you're trying to predict causal relationships. You may learn some things in qualitative research that make you think about causal relationships, but there's no way you can, sort of determine that X predicts Y from qualitative research. Yeah, you usually from quantitative, you're trying to deduce something from a theory that you've got, and whereas in qualitative, you're usually trying to start with the data and induce things out of what kind of theories or relationships might occur. So in quantitative, as I'm sure you all know, you usually need a hypothesis to start research, right? And in qualitative, you often don't start with a hypothesis, and in fact, it's considered sort of wrong to have a hypothesis, which a lot of people have a hard time getting their head around that. But really, again, you're not looking at causal relationships, and you're trying to be very open and exploratory. So really, you don't really want to have a hypothesis before. In general, in quantitative, you would have some sort of theory-driven hypotheses of your relationships between the variables that you're studying, right? And in qualitative, sometimes we do start out with sort of broad theoretical models that guide what we're doing, or we may hope to actually develop our own theory based on the data that we collect. In quantitative, sort of kind of thinking of survey research, it's often very structured. You have predetermined response categories for everything, very neat and clean. But in qualitative, we use very semi-structured instruments or even totally unstructured that we usually talk about interview guides or focus group guides that are sort of kind of rough guidelines about what we want to cover during the interview or the focus group, but are not structured in any way in terms of what responses we expect or the order, even the order that we're going to be talking in. Sampling, of course, in a quantitative study, you would have your exclusion and your inclusion criteria all laid out in advance. You might have random assignment to groups and have a control group. Whereas in qualitative, the goal of our sampling is usually to get the people that can give us the best in-depth information about a certain topic. Who has really lived this? Who can really share with us how this happens? And we often do try to get sort of a variation in we want to get different perspectives of people that are experiencing this issue. But really, we're just trying to get the best and most comprehensive picture of who's involved. And so we don't have we're not trying to be representative of the entire population. You can't. Qualitative studies usually have samples of maybe 20 or 30 interviews or, 8 to 10 focus groups. you're not going for being representative, but you're going for depth with a certain group. The analysis, of course, in quantitative is numerical and statistical. In qualitative, we're talking about really, we're doing verbal descriptions of themes and concepts that come out of the data with no statistics or numbers involved. And again, you know, contrasting with quantitative, where usually you should be, you know, blinded to study conditions, and every single interaction should be the same, supposedly, with every participant. In qualitative research, we actually have to establish a relationship with our participants. If we want people to share their lives with us in an in-depth interview, we need to establish a rapport with them. We need to get them to trust us and open up and share really like intimate details of their lives. So that's a very different type of interaction. Of course, there are limits to that, you know, and in general, in qualitative research, it's not just like a conversation like you would have with a friend, and you're not really sharing much about yourself, because that could really influence the interaction. But you're really trying to have a rapport and a trust that person really opens up and can share things with you. So does anybody have any comments or questions about these? Yes.
This is probably one of the best areas of contrasted between qualitative and quantitative research. Period.
Yes. Thank you. I'm glad, because I have been.
But I'm curious to hear the answer to your question to the group. She asked to you guys.
Well, just if you have any questions about this or anything that seems kind of strikes you as odd or off, or yeah, sure.
When you're doing, like, say, I know you said you weren't going to get into mixed methods, so that's a whole other thing, but the whole, how do you navigate having a hypothesis, not having a hypothesis, if you're going to use both methods in the same?
Right. Well, I guess, and if you're expressing them as different aims, you would have a hypothesis for your quantitative aim in the mixed method study, but not for your qualitative.
Okay.
So yeah, it's usually, and so then you get kind of the advantages of both in some ways.
Relationship with subjects. Do you just acknowledge it, or do you measure it, or do you control it as a confounding factor?
It's a tradition.
What was the question? Sorry. What was the relationship?
Relationship with the subjects. How do we? Well, one thing is, when you're writing out your research, there's something called reflexivity.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry. She's asking, like, how do we kind of account for the fact that we have this relationship with the participants? So how do we, and so I think there's something called reflexivity in qualitative research, where you need to reflect a lot on, how you ask the questions, who you are, everything, how that may have influenced the way that the participant talked to you, right? And so, and if you do have some kind of prior relationship with the participants, I hope people are on the phone, I hope they can hear. If you have to acknowledge.
So if you are on the phone, please mute your mic.
Mute yourself, please.
You should acknowledge if you have some kind of prior relationship with the participants, or even just, like maybe, you're a physician that works in that clinic. How does that influence the way the participants react to you and the responses they give? That's something that medical people often ask me about. Can I do my own interviews or focus groups? And it's a little bit, difficult, because as a physician, you have a certain relationship, and almost power relationship with clients. So I usually don't recommend it, but if there is some kind of relationship, you acknowledge it, you write about it, you think about it, how it might influence your results. So.
Okay.
Yes.
such an important slide. I'm sorry. I'm curious, in this group, how many have had some experience in qualitative research?
And that's funny because that's my next slide.
Can you go back?
Yeah, sure.
I'm curious about their experiences.
Well, that's what I was going to just ask them about their experiences.
Okay, so I'll
Yeah.
keep going.
No, it's fine.
So, keep on going.
So what are your experiences with qualitative research? It's the same
Well, I
question.
took your class, and basically I've been doing qualitative study to interview patients, caregivers with end-stage liver disease, and then also the clinical provider group of hepatologists and healthcare clinicians to figure out, what are the needs for end-stage liver disease and sort of inform an intervention development. And so, through the class, one of the big things was, I knew a lot of these clinicians, so how do I get over that bias? And so, thankfully I have a research assistant who did those interviews. But now I'm realizing, even with data analysis, there's so much bias that comes in. We're doing multiple coding, so I'll do coding, and then my research assistant, she'll also do it. But there's just so much bias that comes in to even.
Yeah, well, it's not really bias. I don't know what you mean.
But I think, for me, the thing is, I'm coming into this research sort of with the belief that, I think palliative care would be helpful for patient care.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's very difficult to overcome. I'm realizing, as I'm doing some of the.
Yeah, well, that's good that you're aware of it and you're recognizing it, and you should write about it in your qualitative research memos and really think about it, and try to see how it's and it can push you then to ask questions that are a little bit outside of that. If you realize that you're a little bit too much in favor of palliative care, what kind of questions could I ask to actually get people to talk about disadvantages, or so I think it's good that you're reflecting on it.
So the role of the theory, I would not disagree with anything you're the expert. As I'm thinking as a user and as a researcher, I think the component that you are also articulating is you need a framing of your problem or question. So that's not necessarily a theoretical framework. Sometimes you do that. Sometimes it's a theoretical model and so forth. But in terms of framing, what it means is if someone wants to examine the perspectives of palliative care in end-stage liver disease, there has to be some framing as to this is what I'm looking. I may use a checklist to ask questions, but I may want to open other aspects, and those other aspects have to be, am I wrong? They have to be framed in some particular area, or not?
No, I think you're right. The only exception might be when we're talking about grounded theory research, which I'm going to mention, which is, according to the pure grounded theory people, you have to go in with completely, kind of almost a blank slate, because you're really trying to be so open and then actually build a framework or a theory based grounded in the data. But that is only a specific type of qualitative research. In most cases, we do have a conceptual framework, a frame, something that helps us figure out what kind of questions we're going to ask. And of course, we all have read the literature. We know something about the topic, so it's hard to go in with a completely blank slate, I would say. So yeah, has anyone else been involved in qualitative research?
Yes, I have conducted some focus groups with patients and providers, and also non-group techniques.
Oh, good. You've
And also,
experienced with that.
currently we conduct the semi-structured interviews with the staff and patients.
On what topic?
In lupus.
Lupus. Okay, great.
So nominal group technique,
Yes.
focus groups, what was the third?
And interviews.
Interviews. So you've done a lot of different ones. Great.
Different.
Different topics. Okay. All right. Well, so I'm going to go on, keep going a bit because we've got a lot to cover. Just an illustration of, again, another difference between qualitative and quantitative. So maybe you're trying to understand how women react to pregnancy. And so if you had to do it, maybe you were going to just do a survey and you would ask women, if I found out I was pregnant, I would be, and then you've got these categories where they have to choose one: sad, mad, happy, don't know, other. Okay, you could do that survey and maybe people would be, choose something. But in a qualitative approach, you would just ask people in a very open-ended manner, can you please tell me how you would feel if you were pregnant? And you can see this woman says, oh, the worst possible thing that could happen to me right now would be to get pregnant. I love my son, I do want more kids, but I have plans. There are things I want to do. I'm in college, my job, my parents would just die, and my friends they wouldn't understand. If I got pregnant now, I would kill myself. But the love of a new baby, that smell, that skin, oh, that's wonderful. So you can see, this person has a real mixture of feelings about this that wouldn't be captured at all by that survey question, and I don't know what she would have picked, but this just allows you to capture some of that complexity, because we know that when we have surveys with predetermined answer choices, they may not yield the best results if we don't really have a good understanding of how people may respond. And so sometimes the categories we choose are not appropriate. So in that case, open-ended questions can be a better alternative and release your participants from those constraints of those predetermined categories. So I'm going to give you again a little bit of whirlwind tour of the approaches to qualitative research. These are some of the major ones. There are others, but so one major approach is phenomenology. And this is something that we use in a lot of our studies. We are trying to understand participants' lived experiences. How do people understand, interpret, and find meaning in their experiences? So that often uses one-on-one, in-depth interviews to get people to really talk and reflect on the phenomenon that you're interested in. The other one I mentioned just a while ago is grounded theory. And this, it's a pretty intense approach. It has a lot of structure. People who have done quantitative research actually sort of like it because it's very structured in a way, but it really, it uses a very inductive approach to actually try to develop theories and frameworks starting from the ground up, grounded in the experiences of people you talk to. How can you develop a theory that explains why people act the way they do? Phenomenology is more from the tradition of anthropology, and in that case, you're aiming to get a real insider's view of how members of a particular group see their world and experience their world. So, in that case, this is where you would spend like a long time in the setting. You might go to, it doesn't have to be this, but go to a village in Papua New Guinea and live there for years, like Margaret Mead, and learn everything about their culture, a lot of participant observation, a lot of talking to people. Or you could, say you want to study injection drug users in Birmingham, Alabama. You might go and hang out on the street corners where people are doing that for an extended point of time and really immerse yourself in that culture and learn more about it. Narrative research or life histories is something that also is a qualitative method where you're really trying to explore the lives of individuals. So you might do several interviews with people over time to learn their entire life story and trajectory. And that can sometimes be very illuminating for what influences people's health or lives over the life course. Case study is another method where you would choose certain cases of something to try to get an in-depth analysis of what's going on in a single case or multiple cases. So, for example, what if maybe you're studying health departments who have campaigns for the HPV vaccine, and you want to maybe you want to study some health departments have been very successful and they've gotten a lot of people vaccinated, and some health departments, nothing's happening. And so maybe then you're going to choose a few of them to really study in depth, maybe some of the successful ones, some of the not successful ones, and do maybe interviews and look at documents and do observations and everything that you can to sort of elucidate those cases as examples, what's going on. This framework approach is sort of, again, it's kind of a combination of inductive and deductive approaches where you do use a kind of a framework and literature to frame your overall qualitative study, but then you very much enrich that with themes that arise from the data. So I'm just going to say a little bit more about a few of these, maybe the more common ones. Phenomenology, again, is that you want to get an in-depth reflective description of people's experiences, their phenomena. And so you generally interview several individuals who have experienced the phenomenon to understand how people interpret, how they experience this issue that you're interested in, how they interpret it, how they make decisions. And so this is a method that we can often adapt in health sciences research. So for example, if you were studying HIV testing for children, you would say, what are the lived experiences of caregivers who seek HIV tests for their children? And you would talk to parents and say, okay, what was that? Tell me about that when you took your kid for an HIV test. What was that like? And they're going to just talk to you a lot about their experience, how they interpreted it, etc. Now, the other approach that I mentioned that is pretty popular in health research as well is it's called grounded theory. And so there, you want to really move beyond this kind of general description. You don't want to just describe how people are experiencing it. You actually want to generate a theory that describes a process, an action, or interaction. And you do that through a lot of in-depth interviewing, research with participants to understand why and how they make decisions or do certain behaviors. So this is really, it's often about, grounded theory should be about a process or behavior. And you want to see what influences that behavior and kind of come up with a framework that can help us understand. So, and it's called grounded theory because your theory is grounded in the data. You go into these interviews with a very open mind. You do your coding and analysis and figure out how people describe what they're going through. And you then come up with a theory that may start to explain it. And so there are a lot of very, detailed books about this method if people are interested. And so in this case, if your research question for grounded theory would be more about the process. So what is the process that caregivers go through when deciding to have their children tested for HIV? So you would try to describe that through your research. And again, people do use some existing theoretical or conceptual frameworks when they're doing qualitative research. There are many sort of models and theories out there in the field of health behavior that can help guide what we're doing. So things like the socio-ecological model, health belief model, locus of control, stages of change, intersectionality theory. These kind of frameworks can help you start thinking about the topic and figuring out what questions you might want to ask people to get to more depth. Now, as I mentioned before, when you're sampling in qualitative research, you want to try to find the right people to answer your question without leaving out people who may confirm or disconfirm your analysis. So you want to get people who have experience with the phenomena, and you want to make sure that you're including different subgroups that may have a different view on this. So, if you're, maybe you want to make sure, like, for example, if you're trying to find out how parents decide to get their children tested for HIV. You want to find, of course, parents who have gotten their children tested for HIV. I guess you could also interview some who didn't to see why they didn't. But if you're really interested about the process of making that decision, you would interview those people, and you might also make sure that you have different types of parents, like maybe single parents and, you know, same-sex parents. And I know everybody that, you know, might have a different perspective on this that you want to include. So you just want to make sure, you know, that you're choosing a sample where the topic of your interest is going to be seen and people are going to have something to say and talk about it. And, you know, a context where you will see the phenomenon. Oh, okay. So see, these are some of the sampling methods that we talk about in qualitative research. So one is, they talk about purposive sampling, or sometimes it's called theoretical sampling. So there you're trying to choose people according to criteria that are relevant for your research question or the theory that you're developing. And it depends on, you know, you have to think about people that can give you different perspectives, but in-depth information on what you're talking about. Often in qualitative research, we use some kind of a quota sampling. Like we know that we want to, you know, make sure that we learn about this issue from the perspectives of both men and women, maybe both, you know, racial and ethnic minorities and whites. And so we might set quotas that we want to make sure we do at least maybe 5 interviews or something with each of these subgroups, so that we make sure we get the variation. And you choose those variables based on what you sort of know from the literature and your experience. So if you know that this issue, utilization of the service, differs a lot for blacks versus whites, or you know that men and women have different rates of using the service, well, then you know that those are variables that you probably want to make sure that you include in your quota sampling for the qualitative research as well. In some cases, people do use snowball sampling, and that means, you know, I would interview you, and then I would say, who else do you know anybody else I could talk to that would really have something that they could share with me about this topic, and you would refer me to someone that you know similar to you that's also gone through this experience, and I would go forward like that. And that is particularly important for hard to reach populations and very, very sensitive topics where it's not easy. You know, if you want to, you know, do a survey with, you know, sex workers who have, you know, who visit STI clinics or something, you know, it might not be easy to advertise that or find them easily. So one way it could be is to talk to one of the sex workers, you got a great interview, and you say, okay, do you have any of your friends or colleagues who would also be willing to talk to me? And so again, you might say, oh, this is biased, but in the case of these hard to reach populations, it may be the only way that you can actually find people. And then you just have to acknowledge again, you know, well, we started off with this person and they referred us to that person. And so we may have only captured a certain portion of the population. There's something called respondent-driven sampling, which is similar to snowball sampling, but it has a mathematical model that actually compensates for the fact that the sample was selected in a non-random way. That's something that some people again use for hard to reach populations. So this is just an example of one of the studies that I do a lot of research in Kenya and with pregnant women and male partners. And so this is a part of one of our mixed methods studies. Of course, we had a quantitative portion as well, but we wanted to know why some pregnant women in rural Kenya do not use maternity services. So they don't go for prenatal care or have their babies at healthcare facilities. What's going on there? So we knew that certain groups were important in this. So we felt from our prior knowledge and experience in these communities, we knew that we needed to talk to pregnant and postpartum women themselves. We also needed to talk to traditional birth attendants who do deliveries of things in homes. We also knew that we probably needed to talk to the male partners of these women and some of their other family members, like mothers-in-law and other groups. And then we also wanted to talk to community health workers who know these communities very well and do home visits. So in each of these 4 communities that we had, we did a certain number of these interviews. But the thing is, this also needs to be flexible. You know, you set these kind of usually rough quotas, but then you need to pay attention while you're collecting the data to see if you need to make adjustments to this, add additional groups possibly, or do more or fewer interviews. And so this comes to a concept that you may have heard called saturation. And so in qualitative research, it's generally good practice to say that you'll continue your interviews or data collection until you reach saturation. It's a kind of a vague concept. It's a little bit hard to often get your hands on, but basically in qualitative research, you start coding and analyzing from the beginning. Okay, you don't wait until you've finished all your interviews and your focus groups and then start analyzing. You start analyzing from day 1 and start reading. You're reading your interviews, you're coding, you're thinking about things. And through that process, you get a sense, you get to a point where you've done a certain amount of interviews and no new information is really coming out. You're not getting any different themes or very widely differing views. And you feel like you've pretty much fleshed out the topic that you tried to capture. And so it's a little bit of a nebulous term, but you have that ability to just sort of keep going until you feel like you've achieved saturation. So we usually, when we're writing proposals for qualitative research, we say we will do 15 to 20 interviews with this group, or we always give a kind of a range because we want to give ourselves room to be able to do more or less depending on whether we feel like we've achieved saturation. And so you've figured out the theory that you wanted to figure out. You feel like you're not getting any new information, and that's when you feel like you can feel sort of satisfied and stop. It's a tough thing because you have to write proposals, you have budgets, you have a certain number of interviews that you plan to do. But if you can build in some flexibility so you can actually feel that you've achieved saturation when you finish your data collection. So in terms of analysis of qualitative data, it usually involves coding and classifying observations and deriving major and minor themes. And so usually what we report in qualitative reports are major themes, sub-themes, and then quotations that express the participants' perspectives in their own words. So if you've read qualitative articles, they're full of quotes, right? And what you have to do is go from this huge amount of pages and pages and pages of transcripts and focus groups, interviews, and kind of shrink that down to a manageable summary of what you found. And so when you're doing qualitative analysis, the first step is coding. So you go through your transcripts, interviews, and attach codes to bits of text. So you go through, take a chunk of text, see, okay, what themes do I see in that chunk? And you can, using the software or by hand, you can attach those codes to text. And so there are different ways you can do it. We have the lumpers versus the splitters. And so some people like to code in very, very, very fine detail, small subtopics, and then kind of lump them together into bigger themes. Other people like to start with major kind of big themes and code for that first, and then go in for a second, more in-depth look where you get all the fine detail of each topic. So it's really a preference different people may have. But this is from Dr. Natalia Ivankova, who is another expert on qualitative research on campus, and I think she likes the lumper approach. And so here she talks about how you initially read through the data, divide it up, start coding those segments of the text, and then kind of reduce it down till you have like maybe 5 or 7 major themes. So as I mentioned, there are software tools to help us with the qualitative coding and analysis task, which it is a big task. And so there, NVivo is the software that we have available here on campus. There are a few others like Atlas TI, and Deduce is an online tool. But these are basically just tools to help you organize, review, code, and analyze the data. They, really you have to still do all the hard work yourself in terms of the thinking and coming up with the themes and the theory building. But these are just kind of tools that make it easier for you to be sort of systematic about it. I mean, it's not like you put in all your interviews and then write a code to do a logistic regression and something pops out. I know it's not that easy, but in this case, it's still a lot of heavy lifting, and Sandhya can probably attest to that it's a lot of work, and but it's really helpful to have it all organized in a database like that, so you can search. If maybe you've got 30 transcripts and you want to see what did people in my data set, in my sample, say about condoms. And so if you've coded for condoms throughout your entire data set, then it brings up everything that everyone said about condoms. So that's a great function to have. Yes.
Sorry, linking what you just said to what Sam asked about how do you intertwine. Let's say for your pregnancy feeling example, the quantitative approach is, let's say, I want to see how mad pregnant women are, for example, correct? And the 1 through 7, if that has been validated, isn't that working for like a pain scale?
Right.
7, well, that works. If Sam wants to not only know that, but say, well, what other things pregnant women feel about to have surgery, for example? Sometimes we include, do you feel any other things as a comment, free text, right, Tuesdays? And here what you're saying is that open-ended small place is actually biased by the prior question. I get that. But let's say that if we want to insert something because we're curious, it's more exploratory. I just want to see what people say, knowing that that's not the strongest qualitative result. Right. Are you with me?
Yes.
Did I lose anybody? Okay. In that component, is there any, and again, forgive me, quick and easy thing to put into something like that, to have the computer spell out something that can help you go through realms of data is not high caliber research.
Well, I mean, you can do what's really kind of more like what they call kind of a basic content analysis.
Basic.
So it's not like, this is what I'm talking about is really more about thematic analysis, which would be more in depth. But if you just, and you can do with the software, you can do searches just based on words if you want. I mean, you can just, without even, you could have the program software come up with all paragraphs that have the word condom in them. You mean you can do
what?
Yeah. So you can do those kind of more sort of automated quick searches easily.
You have to tell them what program.
Yeah, NVivo. This is NVivo, but I think all the programs can do this that I've mentioned, like Atlas TI and Deduce. So you can do a more or just surfacey kind of content analysis. I hate to say, but that can sometimes be very helpful, and that's exactly what you need, right?
What if I put all of those concepts into one of those word clouds? So, and again, it's not high end. Is all.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm going to show you one in a minute, a word cloud that we made. Well, because the program does create word clouds too, which is good for posters. Anyway, so just quickly, some people have criticize qualitative research, although it's becoming more and more accepted. I've just come back from NIH grant reviews, and almost every single grant has a qualitative component in it now. So, but you know, some people still think that it's not rigorous, that it's just journalism or reporting or anecdotal. They, you know, are disturbed about the researcher bias aspect, and they say it's not reproducible, it lacks generalizability. But I think, you know, qualitative research has the slightly different standards that it's judged by, but if we do it, we can do it in a very rigorous way that can convince these people, these critics, that it's actually valid and strong. So when we're talking about qualitative research, we talk about credibility. So the truth value of the findings. So you want to give confidence in the truth of the findings, and do that by giving a very accurate and detailed description of the context and the findings. You want it to be dependable, meaning that the research process itself has to be very consistent and carried out with careful attention to the rules and conventions of qualitative methodology. You should try to demonstrate confirmability, that you need to use some methods to be able to confirm that the data are as accurate as possible. And I'll show you some of the methods for that in a minute. And even though we don't really talk about generalizability, I mean, so if you do a research, you know, a qualitative study with 20 African-American mothers who are breastfeeding in Birmingham, you're not going to be able to say that this is generalizable to all African-American mothers in Birmingham. But you still may find things that may be transferable or applicable for similar populations or other people besides the ones that you interviewed. So there's usually a feeling that some of the knowledge is at least transferable. So in terms of trying to establish validity and reliability and generalizability, so there are different methods that you can use to give more validity to your qualitative research. You can triangulate by using a couple different types of methods to get at your topic. We have something called member checking, where after you've done some of your coding and results, you go back to members of the population and, you know, present your findings to them and see what they think. Does this make sense? Does this really accurately describe your experience? You give very rich and thick description of everything you're talking about. You clarify the biases. You acknowledge and clarify the biases. And you're always trying to present, if there are, maybe there's a general theme that most of the people in your sample it resonates with them. But if there are any like minority views or people that spoke differently, you need to include that in your write-up as well. So it's not like in quantitative research, you would like exclude the outliers, you know. In this case, you actually value the outliers, and you acknowledge in your write-up that maybe only one or two people said this, but it still can be a very important theme. We spend a prolonged time in the field. We do a lot of debriefing among our peers and our research team. And in some cases, there could be even an external auditor that goes and revisits people and does another interview and tries to confirm that the results are valid. That's rare. Reliability, again, is using a consistent approach that's across different analysts and projects. So if you've got a team of qualitative coders, they need to establish consistency, that everyone's coding in the same way, which is challenging. And again, your focus is really not on generalizability, but on getting in depth in that particular population. So just make sure that you've got a systematic and self-conscious research design, and your approach to data gathering, interpretation, and communication is all clear. And so you want to, when you're writing up your qualitative research, you really have to carefully describe all the steps that you've done, who's involved, and everything, so that there's a good record, and that then you can produce a plausible and coherent explanation of what you're trying to study. So there is some guidance from NIH on both qualitative and mixed methods research, and so this Qualitative methods in health research is from the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at NIH, and that gives you some information on the standards for conducting and proposing and reporting qualitative research. There also is this best practices for mixed methods research in the health sciences has just come out with a new 2018 version. So if you are writing a mixed methods proposal, I would strongly suggest you take a look at that. But just, you know, if you are including qualitative methods in your proposal, make sure you're very clearly and systematically describing your data collection methods. Talk about, you know, why qualitative methods are appropriate for studying this topic and why they are most likely to produce the findings that you need. So again, you know, people are mainly accept qualitative research now, but I think you still need to say, you know, for this aim, we're using qualitative research because we really need to understand in depth the reasons that people are doing this. And so, I mean, that's just an example, but you need to also include in your proposal a discussion of kind of the universe that you're studying, but also how your sample is being selected from that universe. You need to specify the time frames for your data collection and very carefully present the nature of the data that you're going to be collecting and describe the coding and analytic procedures. So all of these things are going to be expected to be seen in your proposal. And so if you are including an aim, a qualitative aim in your specific aims, again, here you can ask a broad open-ended question and not necessarily have any kind of specific hypothesis. And, you know, and also just make it clear that you anticipate that these insights are going to emerge during the course of the research that may steer the research in unforeseeable directions. It's a fine line. I mean, of course, NIH reviewers and people, they want to see that you have a clear plan, you know what you're doing, everything's very laid out ahead of time. But on the other hand, you also need to fit in the flexibility that, you know, you may discover that you need to interview a different group, or you may discover that focus groups don't work and you need to go to in-depth interviews instead. So building some of that in is a good thing. When you're talking about the significance of your topic and the innovation, I mean, you're going to bring in literature on, of course, your topic and literature on the population you're studying, and if you are using a theoretical or conceptual framework, you may bring in some literature on the qualitative methodology itself that you're using when you're talking about that work. And then when you get to the research design and methods part of the proposal, I mean, again, you have to give justification for the approach you're using and the rationale and why you're choosing these qualitative methods. Why are you doing in-depth interviews and not focus groups? Why are you doing observations? And you also have to demonstrate the feasibility. So you have to show that you have the team, you have the qualification, and you have the experience to do, you know, qualitative research. So, you know, you won't want to submit a proposal that has a big qualitative aim and you have no one on your team that's ever done qualitative research. You know, you need to have someone that's known to be an expert. And then your whole design and methods have to be described carefully as we've discussed. And so when they talked about, there was a workshop on NIH, they talked about how to, you know, propose qualitative methods. And they really want, when you're proposing qualitative methods, they suggested that you watch your language, because most of the reviewers are more familiar with quantitative methods, right? You know, even though there's more and more qualitative expertise, most reviewers are more quantitative, and just some concepts may have different meanings and may be applied differently in qualitative and quantitative. So you have to make sure you're very clear. So, you know, it may not be enough to say, for example, we will use a theoretical or a propositive sampling method, or maybe you're going to say data will be collected using semi-structured interviews and participant observation. People may not necessarily know what those things are, so you need to go in a little bit more more detail and explain with references. So define your terms and give specific descriptions of how they'll be applied in the study. And just, orient your reviewers to the qualitative method that you're using. Describe it and maybe have references of the people that developed that method or interpreted it. If you've got any examples of studies, similar studies that have used these methods, you can cite those and use those. And giving, as I said, the rationale for using these methods. Okay, again, this was really the whirlwind overview of qualitative research. I'm going to just very briefly show you an example from our own research, but any other comments or questions at this point? Yes.
I had a question about, and I know you were talking about, you've been to like grant reviewing and all that, and I'm just curious what your experience has been like with, in that group. Like, do you tend to have to explain to other people, like, no, this is standard for qualitative methodology, or what is that experience been like in terms of
it's and of course the study sections that I am on are social and behavioral aspects of HIV, so people are probably a lot more in tune to this in our study sections than in some others, I'm guessing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because the thing that I find myself discussing and harping a lot in study sections is mixed methods, because people are still, they just use that term very loosely, and mixed methods research is actually a very specific thing that has specific study designs. And the key thing is when you're doing mixed methods research, you have to integrate qualitative and quantitative findings. It's not enough to just say, oh, we're going to do this qual, we're going to do this quant. You have to specifically talk about how you're going to integrate them. And so I sound like a broken record in study section. I'm like, oh, sorry. Again, that's really a key thing for mixed methods research. But I feel like a lot of people do understand the importance of qualitative and they see the value of it. So, but I don't know if people are in like a cardiology study section or something else.
I would say that there has been more of it's still a mixed bag, but there definitely are more people who understand to some degree. I'm not at your level, but I think that you usually find a couple of people who know, the value of qualitative research and are able to kind of give guidance even if they're not a primary reviewer.
Yeah, people speak up and they say things, and then and the thing is, what I often see in the qualitative research in these proposals is that the analytical methods are usually described very briefly and very insufficiently. Like, people don't really realize that they need to put as much into that as they do into their quantitative analysis sections. So often I see people getting a lot of feedback on that. So.
I totally agree with you, because I review grants for PCORI addressing health disparities. So people like to use the mixed method, but they did not integrate it.
Yeah, no, it's fighting for that, yes.
I just came back from an implementation science meeting at the VA. And so listen to everything she said, because on VA funded, no matter what you do, they want to see something of a qualitative component in some degree. Either the Cadillac of everything is that surface, or some component of being rigorous. Not, hey, let me just make this up.
Yeah.
Some component of the qualitative component, because part of the idea is how do we implement this in practice, from the research, finding new knowledge. And we have several people who do quality and safety implementation. We have quality scholars. So even if you don't want to do research, we still need to know how to do the qualitative component to be able to translate that into practice. So the VA is dying to see more and more of this. Good quality.
Good quality.
Not hey, back at the end of our making this up as I'm going.
Yes, that's true. Okay, so just very, very briefly, I'm just as an example. So this is an NIH-funded study that we have, which is having to do with women and HIV. It's the Women's Adherence and Visit Engagement Study, or we call it WAVE. And so this is a 5-year R1 study where we're trying to understand the mechanisms and longitudinal effects of stigma on women's adherence to antiretroviral medications and their outcomes in a large cohort study. But we did, we have an aim 3, which is a mixed methods aim. So here we aim to examine the link between intersectional stigma, which that means stigma, when people experience stigma and discrimination because of different parts of their identity. So here we're looking at stigma around HIV, stigma around race and ethnicity, stigma around poverty, and stigma around gender. And we look at how those intersect to influence women's adherence to HIV treatment recommendations and using mixed methods research. And so again, this intersectional stigma, it's a whole another topic, but this is based on a basic framework or theory around intersectionality, and which talks about how there are these interrelationships between people's different social identities and experience, and so how does that create both vulnerabilities and marginalization, or sometimes opportunities when people have these multiple identities. And so, for instance, women of color living with HIV may experience racism associated with HIV-related stigma, but might also experience social support and solidarity from other women of color living with HIV. Anyway, it's a complex area of study, but basically we're trying to move beyond a single axis framework of studying discrimination, and that kind of assumes that these things are kind of additive, but we really think it's much more complex than that. And so this intersectionality is something that some people even argue that you can't study it with quantitative methods. It's just too complex. I mean, how can you how can I as a person disentangle the effects of me being, a white woman, academic, from Indiana? I don't know. It's so much a part of your whole identity that it's very often difficult to disentangle how those different aspects affect you. There's the word cloud, yay! So this is created by in vivo Qualitative Research Program, and so basically, so we did a qualitative component to study this intersectionality, and Whitney Rice, who is a graduate of this program, who's now assistant professor at Emory, was the lead on this research. And so basically, in addition to the quantitative surveys that we did about all these different types of stigma and discrimination, we also did this kind of a subset of qualitative research where we did in-depth qualitative interviews with 76 women in different sites in the United States, getting a mix of race and ethnicities, income, sexual orientation, and this is an older cohort, so everybody was 34 or older. But we were able to elucidate a lot of really interesting themes, and actually Whitney has published this in Social Science and Medicine recently around intersectionality. And just to get at this quote kind of shows the complexity. All my life, I've always wondered what people discriminated against me for. Is it because I was Black? Is it because I was biracial? I never knew if people were discriminating me because I was HIV positive, because I was a woman. Honestly, I don't know what. I can't really pinpoint. I just know that something, I guess it's like a gut feeling, something just didn't feel right. Like somebody insulted me, and later I'm like, what was that for? So this is the kind of thing that women described, and we found that women talked about experiencing stigma and discrimination around being a woman, around their race or ethnicity, around being poor. But women also talked about stigma around incarceration experiences, age, and body image. So these were all women living with HIV, but they also had all these other things that were impacting their lives and how they felt people treated them. So I don't think I have a lot of time, so I'm just going to skip quickly through these, but you know, people talked about how sexism kind of intersected with HIV stigma, how both racism, sexism, and HIV came together in some instances, or again about how being poor and how people treat poor people affected their experiences living with HIV. And, you know, just to give you a flavor of the mixed methods, part of it, we are doing very sophisticated quantitative analyses using latent profile analysis to try to see how these different types of stigma discrimination impact women's outcomes quantitatively. So that's the thing about mixed methods research too. You have to do a very rigorous job of both methods. You have to, you know, it's not like, you know, you can do, you know, really, really great in-depth qualitative research and then just do something kind of lame on the quantitative side. Both elements have to be really done and according to the highest standards of both types of methods. So again, I'm not going to go through this, but just, I mean, in conclusion, you can see that qualitative research it's complex, it is demanding, it's very time-consuming, you know, mainly I would say on the coding and analytical side of things. I mean, maybe you could do, you know, get some in-depth interviews done in a month or two, but then the time that it takes to really develop your coding framework, code all those transcripts, think about it. I mean, so it can be expensive in terms of time that it takes for coders and analysts to really work with the data. But it's also really engaging, very satisfying, and actually fun. I mean, the experience of doing these interviews and focus groups and observations is you get such valuable insights into what people are living and experiencing, and people sharing with you and opening up their lives. So you really can get an in-depth understanding of very complex problems and how people live those things, and then this information can be really valuable to develop, you know, programs and services that people need. So I encourage everyone to utilize, get involved. I mean, and even if you don't do qualitative research yourself, collaborate with people who do and work in teams. And I think it can really bring a lot of richness to a lot of the research that many of you are doing. So, and I teach a class on qualitative research methods, a graduate class. It's usually in the fall semester. It's a semester-long class, 1 day a week class that Sonia has taken and others. So feel free to check that out. And there are other, Natalia Ivankova in the School of Health Professions has several online courses on either mixed methods or qualitative research. In our Center for AIDS Research webpage, we have a lot of resources for qualitative research. So feel free to check those out or contact me if you want to discuss further.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Great, thank you so much for being here. Please be sure to badge in before you leave today. And next week we will have Dr. Lisa Jackson presenting. What are you doing?